It was not of this world. It is something that I have never seen before. A huge, I do not know, spaceship. It was just awesome. It was frightening. Those are the words of Captain Kenju Terauchi, a veteran Japan Airlines pilot with nearly 3 decades of flight experience, speaking to federal investigators about what he saw over Alaska on the night of November 17, 1986. He was not a crank. He was not a rookie. He was one of the most experienced commercial aviators on the planet. And what he reported that night became the subject of an official FAA investigation that would shake the agency to its foundation.
Last time, we went deep into the Lakenheath incident, a 1956 case where British and American military radar, ground observers, and an airborne fighter pilot all tracked the same unidentified object at the same time. It was the gold standard for multi-sensor confirmation. But here's the thing that stayed with me after that episode. Those encounters were brief. We're talking seconds, maybe minutes, at extreme range and speed. What we're looking at today is something completely different. 50 minutes. A crew of 3 professional aviators, multiple radar systems, and an object that one of them described as twice the size of an aircraft carrier.
That description is in the official FAA investigation file. Document 733667001. It is not a tabloid headline. It is not a secondhand account. It is a statement made by Captain Terauchi during a formal interview with federal investigators, recorded and transcribed as part of one of the most thorough government investigations of a UAP encounter ever conducted by a civilian aviation authority. Today, we are going to walk through that file page by page.
So the core question for today, what is the single most well-documented UFO encounter by a commercial airliner on record? By the end of this episode, you are going to have a real answer to that question. Not a maybe, not a some people claim, but an answer built on radar data, cockpit voice recordings, air traffic control transcripts, and 3 separate crew interviews conducted under oath by federal investigators. To help us make sense of all of it, we brought in someone who has spent his career in cockpits and knows exactly what pilots are trained to see, trained to report, and trained to dismiss. Commander Rick Malone flew Navy FA-18s for 14 years before transitioning to commercial aviation. He's logged over 11,000 hours across military and civilian aircraft, and he's served as a safety investigator for the Navy's aviation mishap review process, which means he spent years sitting across from pilots, asking them exactly what they saw and whether they could be wrong about it. Malone, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And I'll tell you up front, I came to this case as a skeptic. When you spend as much time as I have asking pilots hard questions about what they thought they saw versus what they actually saw, you develop a pretty high threshold for taking a report at face value. Optical illusions, spatial disorientation, light refraction at altitude, there are 100 ways a trained pilot can be fooled. I know all of them. So when I first read through the Terauchi file, I was looking for the explanation. I was looking for the out. I didn't find one.
That's a significant statement coming from someone with your background. What was it specifically that made this case stand out to you?
The duration, first of all. Most misidentification cases resolve themselves quickly. You see something weird, you look away, you look back, it's gone, or it's obviously a star or another aircraft. Terauchi and his crew tracked these objects for close to 50 minutes. You don't maintain a 50-minute misidentification at cruise altitude in a 747. Your instruments tell you things. Your crew tells you things. The radio tells you things. The fact that this encounter persisted and that the crew's account remained internally consistent throughout is what separates it from the vast majority of pilot reports I've ever reviewed.
And we're not just taking the crew's word for it. That's the other thing. There's a paper trail here that most cases don't have.
That is precisely what makes this case exceptional. The FAA investigation file runs to dozens of pages. It includes the initial incident report filed the night of the encounter, formal transcribed interviews with all 3 crew members conducted separately, air traffic control radio transcripts, radar data analysis, and internal FAA memos documenting the agency's response in real time. This is not a retrospective reconstruction. This is a contemporaneous federal investigation, and the documents exist because the FAA took this seriously enough to generate them.
Okay, so let's set the scene. November 1986. What was the world looking like? What was the United States government's official position on UFOs at this point?
By November 1986, the Air Force had been out of the UFO business officially for 17 years. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's formal program to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena, had closed in December 1969 following the Condon Report, which concluded that UFO investigations offered no scientific value. The official government line was that the subject was closed. There was no active investigation. There was no program. The Air Force had looked at the data and found nothing worth pursuing. That was the public position.
And in practice, what that meant for pilots was that you didn't report this stuff. Not officially, not through military channels, not in a way that would follow you. I can tell you from personal experience in the Navy, if you came back and said you saw something you couldn't identify, the best-case scenario was that people looked at you funny. The worst case was that it showed up in your fitness report as a judgment question. The culture around reporting was deeply, deeply suppressive. So when a civilian pilot in 1986 filed a formal report and sat for federal interviews, that took real courage.
Which tells you something right there. Terauchi had to know what he was walking into by going on record.
He absolutely did. And he did it anyway. That tells you something about his level of conviction. This wasn't a guy who saw a light and got excited. He was describing something that, in his professional judgment as a senior captain with Japan Airlines, represented a genuine unknown, and he was willing to stake his reputation on it. That's not nothing. In aviation, your reputation is your career.
Captain Kenju Terauchi had been flying for Japan Airlines since the 1960s. By 1986, he held the rank of captain and had accumulated approximately 10,000 hours of flight time. He was not a junior officer. He was not on his first international route. The Anchorage to Reykjavik cargo run that JAL Flight 1628 was operating that night was a routine polar route, one of the most remote and demanding flight corridors in commercial aviation, crossing the Alaskan interior at altitudes between 35,000 and 39,000 feet, largely out of radar contact with the rest of the world.
So you've got an experienced crew flying a well-known route over one of the most isolated stretches of airspace on the planet. That's the backdrop. What time did this start?
The encounter began at approximately 5:11 p.m. local time on November 17, 1986. The aircraft was a Boeing 747 cargo freighter carrying a load of Beaujolais Nouveau wine from Paris, bound for Tokyo via Anchorage. The crew consisted of 3 men, Captain Terauchi in the left seat, First Officer Takanori Tamafuji in the right seat, and Flight Engineer Yoshi Tsukuba at the engineers panel behind them. All 3 would later be interviewed separately by FAA investigators. All 3 accounts are in the file.
The crew configuration matters here. A 7047 flight deck in 1986 had 3 sets of eyes, 3 sets of instruments, and 3 trained professionals whose entire job is to monitor the environment around the aircraft. You're not talking about a single pilot making a judgment call in isolation. You've got a captain, a first officer, and a flight engineer. And in a case like this, they're all cross-checking each other. If one person sees something, the natural instinct is to confirm it with the other 2 before you do anything else. That's standard operating procedure.
So what did they see first? Walk me through the beginning of the encounter.
According to the initial FAA incident report and Captain Terauchi's subsequent interview, the first objects appeared ahead and to the left of the aircraft, at the same altitude, approximately 2,000 feet below, and roughly 7 or 8 miles distant. Terauchi initially described 2 objects that appeared to be pacing the aircraft, matching its speed and heading. He initially assumed they were military aircraft. Then they moved.
That's the detail that always gets me when I read this account. His first instinct was military. That's what any experienced pilot would think. You see lights ahead of you at altitude over Alaska, you think military traffic. It's a reasonable assumption. The fact that he held that assumption for a period of time before discarding it tells you he was being cautious, not reactive. He wasn't jumping to conclusions. He was doing exactly what a good aviator does, defaulting to the most mundane explanation first.
And then something happened that made the mundane explanation impossible to hold on to.
Correct. The objects performed a maneuver that Terauchi would later describe in his formal FAA interview as unlike anything he had seen in his career. They did not maintain a fixed position relative to the aircraft. They did not behave the way any known aircraft behaves. And then, after an extended period of observation, the two smaller objects were joined by something else. Something dramatically larger. That is when Terauchi made the call to Anchorage Air Route Traffic Control Center, the facility responsible for managing air traffic over Alaska. That radio call is in the FAA file, and we are going to hear it.
Okay, I want to make sure listeners understand what Anchorage ARTCC is, because it's going to come up a lot in this episode. ARTCC, Air Route Traffic Control Center. It's basically the facility that manages aircraft flying through a region. Not the tower at an airport, but the center that tracks everything moving through a huge chunk of airspace. When Terauchi called them, he was calling the people who had radar coverage of his location. And that's critical, because it means we're not just relying on what he saw out the window.
That's exactly right. And here's something people don't always appreciate about that call. Making a UFO report to ATC is not a casual thing. You're creating a record. You're putting it on tape. Controllers are logging it. Other aircraft on that frequency can hear you. When Terauchi keyed that mic and reported unidentified traffic, he knew that conversation was going into a permanent file. That's not the behavior of someone who's unsure about what they saw. That's a captain making a formal professional report of an airborne hazard.
And the FAA didn't just file it away. They opened a full investigation. Which brings us to the documents we're going to spend the next part of this episode working through. The FAA investigation file 733666701 is one of the most complete government records of a UAP encounter ever made public. And it is going to tell a story that is a lot more complicated than either the believers or the skeptics want it to be.
The investigation was initiated almost immediately. By the following day, FAA officials in Alaska were already coordinating with their counterparts in Washington. The file would eventually include radar analysis from multiple facilities, a formal review of the air traffic control recordings, separate transcribed interviews with each member of the crew conducted weeks apart, and internal memoranda documenting the agency's evolving understanding of what had occurred. It is a remarkable record, and it begins with a single page. The initial operations log from Anchorage ARTCC, filled out on the night of the encounter itself.
A log written in real time while it was happening. That's about as close to a primary source as you can get. When we come back, we're going to start reading through that file, starting with the night of November 17, 1986, and working forward through the investigation. And I promise you, by the time we get to what the FAA's own radar analysis concluded, you are going to have a very different picture of this case than anything you've read anywhere else. Before we get into the broader pattern here, I want to take a step back for a second. Because what we've been building toward, this FAA investigation file, the pilot testimony, the radar returns, it doesn't exist in isolation. The JL-1628 encounter is the most documented case of its kind. But it's not the only one, and to understand why that matters, we need to look at what the FAA's own records show, both before and after 1986. Because the agency that investigated Captain Terauchi has been collecting reports like his for decades.
That's the thing people miss when they focus on JAL 1628 as a singular event. It wasn't singular. It was singular in terms of duration and documentation. 50 minutes, radar correlation, a full federal investigation. But the phenomenon Terauchi described? The close proximity, the objects that don't behave like aircraft, the radar that sometimes picks them up and sometimes doesn't? That's a thread that runs through the FAA's records, going back years, and continues right up to the present day. The case files I've seen, and I've seen a few, tell a consistent story.
The first document I want to walk through is an FAA air traffic control log from the Houston area, designated Continental Command UFO sighting logs, filed through an agency record dated May 29, 2009. This is an unclassified operational document, the kind of real-time log that controllers generate when something unusual gets called in. It records a pilot report of an unidentified object that passed within 100 to 200 feet of a commercial aircraft at 13,000 feet, approximately 20 miles southeast of Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport. The object had no radar return on any of the monitoring systems. On page 3 of that log, the entry reads, and I am quoting directly, BTA 2822 RPT OBJ ECT passed 200 FT below and behind ACFT out of 13,000. IQO ADZ. No radar target displayed at 190 or ZHU. The spacing irregularities are in the original. This is a raw controller log, typed in real time. BTA 2822 is the aircraft's call sign. IQO ADZ is controller shorthand for I query advised. The critical phrase is the last one. No radar target displayed at either the TRACON facility or the Houston Air Route Traffic Control Center. Two separate radar systems. Neither one saw anything.
So a pilot reports something passing 200 feet below his aircraft, which, just to put that in perspective, is nothing. That's the length of about 2/3 of a 747. At 13,000 feet, traveling at whatever speed commercial aircraft travel, 200 feet is a near miss. And neither radar system in the area picked it up. Nothing. The pilot saw it. The radar didn't.
200 feet is a collision avoidance emergency. In normal operations, if something passes within 200 feet of your aircraft, you are filing an NMAC, a near mid-air collision report. You are on the radio immediately. The fact that this pilot called it in, that it made it into the controller log, tells me the crew was shaken. They saw something real and close. The no radar target notation is what gets me every time, because modern TRACON radar in the Houston terminal area is not a primitive system. If there's a solid object in that airspace, it should paint. The fact that it didn't means either the object had no radar reflective surface, or it wasn't there in any conventional sense.
And page 4 of the same document confirms it, right? This isn't just the one controller's log.
Correct. Page 4 is the TRACON confirmation, a separate facility log that independently records the same event. It states, BTA 2822 E145 reported a missile passing below his aircraft by 100, 200 FT, 13,000 APX, IAH-1 2020. No radar target displayed. The pilot used the word missile. That is not a word a commercial pilot uses casually. That word tells you something about the object's shape, its speed, or its trajectory, or all three. And again, no radar target displayed. The notifications went out to the appropriate authorities, and the log records that. But the object itself left no electronic trace whatsoever.
When a pilot says missile, he means something cylindrical, fast, and purposeful looking. He's not saying it was a missile. He's reaching for the closest thing in his mental catalog that matches what he saw. That's actually a useful data point. It tells you something about the object's aspect ratio and its apparent velocity. And the fact that it came from below and behind, then passed forward, that's not a balloon. That's not debris. That's something with a flight path.
Okay, and here's what connects this back to Terauchi. In 1986, he described objects that appeared ahead of his aircraft, that moved in apparent coordination with his flight path, and that the radar sometimes caught and sometimes didn't. We're now looking at a 2009 report, 23 years later, where a commercial pilot over Houston describes something that passes within 200 feet of his aircraft, moves with apparent purpose, and leaves zero radar signature. Same pattern, different decade.
That continuity is exactly what makes these records significant. You are not looking at isolated incidents. You are looking at a phenomenon that commercial aviation has been encountering consistently, and that the FAA has been quietly logging for decades. The question is what you do with that information. And historically, the answer has been not much.
The next document sharpens that pattern considerably. and it comes from a location that should feel familiar given what we discussed about JAL 1628. This is FAA Skywatch Incident Report 237 UAP 00225, filed February 21, 2023, unclassified, 1 page. Skywatch is the FAA's current standardized system for logging UAP reports from pilots. It was formalized relatively recently, which is itself a significant development. This report documents a sighting near Kenai, Alaska, that is roughly 200 miles south of the JAL 1628 encounter corridor. A commercial aircraft reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon while flying southwest at 6,000 feet, 52 nautical miles northwest of the Kenai airport. On page 1, the report states, aircraft reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon while SW bound at 6,000 feet, 52 nm NW of ENA. The unknown phenomenon was round and black stationary at approximately 16,000 plus feet. ANR, AK NORAD region, notified. I want to emphasize 3 elements here. First, the object was stationary, it was not moving. Second, it was at 16,000 feet or above, significantly higher than the reporting aircraft, which was at 6,000. Third, the Alaska NORAD region was notified. That is a military escalation. The FAA did not treat this as a weather balloon and close the file. They called the military.
Round, black, stationary, high altitude, Alaska, and NORAD gets a phone call. That last part is the one that stops me. The FAA doesn't call NORAD for a weather balloon. They don't call NORAD for a drone that someone flew too high. NORAD is North American Aerospace Defense Command. That notification means someone at the FAA looked at this report and thought, this is a defense matter.
The NORAD notification is the tell. I've been in airspace where unusual contacts get called in, and the threshold for escalating to NORAD is not low. You don't make that call unless you genuinely cannot account for the object. A stationary object at 16,000 feet with no flight plan, no transponder, no radar return that makes sense, in Alaskan airspace, which is strategically sensitive, that combination of factors would absolutely trigger a military notification. What I'd want to know is what NORAD did with it. And that part of the record, as far as I've seen, isn't public.
And the case is marked closed. We know it was reported, we know NORAD was notified, and then the file ends. No resolution, no explanation, no we determined it was X. Just closed.
That is the standard outcome for the majority of these Skywatch reports. The FAA's mandate is airspace safety, not phenomenon identification. Once the object is no longer an active safety concern, the file closes. Whether NORAD or any other agency pursued it further is not reflected in the FAA record.
And that's a systemic problem. The FAA logs the sighting, notifies the appropriate military authority, and then the thread goes dark. There's no feedback loop. The pilot who reported that round, black object over Alaska never found out what it was. The FAA controller who made the NORAD call never found out what happened next. The information flows in one direction and then disappears into a classification system that the originating agency can't access.
Let me just sit with this for a second, because we're now looking at 2 documents, Houston, 2009, and Alaska, 2023. That bracket the JAL 1628 encounter on both sides of the timeline, before and after, and the pattern is identical: professional pilots, unusual objects, anomalous or absent radar returns, official FAA documentation. The encounter we've been investigating all episode isn't an anomaly. It's part of something much larger.
Much larger and much more consistent than most people realize. The JAL 1628 case got attention because the FAA made the extraordinary decision to go public with it. Most of what we're looking at now, these Skywatch reports, these controller logs, they exist in databases that the public only recently gained access to through FOIA requests and declassification efforts. The tip of the iceberg is enormous. What's underneath it is something else entirely.
Moving forward in the timeline, I want to bring in FAA Skywatch Incident Report 237 UAP 00465, dated February 11, 2023, unclassified. This is a one-page preliminary report from the FAA Operations Center, documenting a sighting by the flight crew of United Airlines Flight 1786, a Boeing 737 MAX 9, operating between Los Angeles and Cleveland. The crew reported the phenomenon while flying eastbound between 35,000 and 37,000 feet, approximately 25 miles south of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The report was filed through Minneapolis Air Route Traffic Control Center, which is the facility that handles high-altitude traffic in that region. On page 1, the report states, Minneapolis ARTCC advised United 1786, B-39M, LAX, CLE, reported lights coming and going at same altitude or higher while E-bound between FL 350 and FL 370, 25S Sioux Falls. The phrase coming and going is the crew's description of the lights appearing and disappearing, not moving from one place to another, but materializing and dematerializing, at the same altitude or higher, meaning the crew was looking at objects at 35 to 37,000 feet or above. And then there is this administrative notation at the bottom of the report. Leos not notified. Law enforcement officers were not notified.
Okay, that last part, law enforcement not notified. That seems like it's buried, but it's actually significant, isn't it? Because we just talked about the Alaska report where NORAD was notified immediately. Here you've got lights appearing and disappearing at cruising altitude, and the decision is made not to escalate. Why would that threshold be different?
The notification protocols aren't perfectly standardized, and that's a problem I've seen discussed in aviation safety circles for years. Whether you escalate depends on how the controller interprets the report, what the duty supervisor decides, and frankly, on institutional culture at that particular facility. The Alaska NORAD notification may have been driven by the strategic sensitivity of that airspace. Alaska is a different environment from South Dakota in terms of military awareness. But lights at cruise altitude appearing and disappearing should absolutely raise a flag. The fact that it didn't reach law enforcement or military notification in this case is an inconsistency that's hard to explain away.
The coming and going description is also worth examining more carefully. In the aviation context, lights that appear and disappear at high altitude without any corresponding radar return are not easily explained by conventional aircraft behavior. A commercial aircraft at that altitude would have strobes, nav lights, and a transponder return. Something that is visible to the crew but absent from radar and appearing intermittently is a genuinely anomalous observation, not a routine misidentification.
And United 1786 is a scheduled commercial flight with a trained crew. These aren't people who are going to call in lights unless they're genuinely uncertain about what they're looking at. You don't file an FAA report as a commercial airline pilot for something you can explain.
You really don't. Your career depends on being the calm, rational voice on the radio. When a commercial crew calls something into ARTCC and says they don't know what it is, that is not a decision made lightly. The social and professional cost of being the pilot who reported the UFO is real. These crews know that. Which means when they report it anyway, they are telling you they had no other choice. What they saw left them no other option but to say something.
That connects directly back to Captain Terauchi. He knew exactly what reporting this would cost him. He reported it anyway, and we've seen what happened to him as a result. So when we're reading these Skywatch reports, these dry, bureaucratic logs, we need to remember there's a human being on the other end of every one of them who made a professional calculation and decided the truth was more important than the career risk.
The next document is one of the most striking in this collection, and I want to set it up carefully. This is FAA Skywatch Incident Report 237 UAP 0604, dated January 27, 2024, unclassified, 1 page. It was filed through the FAA Washington Operations Center and documents a report from the crew of EVA Air Flight 008, a Boeing 777-300ER, operating between Taipei, Taiwan, and San Francisco. At the time of the sighting, the aircraft was westbound at 37,000 feet, 450 nautical miles west of San Francisco. That places the encounter over open Pacific Ocean, in some of the most remote airspace on Earth. On page 1, the report states, Oakland ARTCC advised China registered EV008, B77W, Taipei, Taiwan, RCTP, SFO, reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon of ACFT dogfighting at FEL 500 from the 12 o'clock position. Flight level 500 is 50,000 feet. The crew of EVA-008, flying at 37,000 feet, observed what they described as aircraft dogfighting 13,000 feet above them, directly ahead of their aircraft. The report then states, ATC reported no UAP observed on radar. Oakland Center, which handles Pacific oceanic traffic, had nothing on their screens.
Aircraft dogfighting at 50,000 feet. I need to process that for a second. 50,000 feet is above the operational ceiling of virtually every military aircraft currently in service. The F-22, the F-35, they max out around 65,000 feet, and that's under ideal conditions. Commercial aircraft don't go anywhere near 50,000 feet. So whatever these EVA-0008 pilots were watching, it was operating in airspace where essentially nothing should be. And there's no radar return.
50,000 feet is what we call the high frontier. Very few things operate up there with any regularity. The U-2, some experimental platforms, high-altitude balloons. But dogfighting at 50,000 feet implies two or more objects maneuvering aggressively relative to each other at an altitude where the air is so thin that conventional aerodynamics barely function. The energy required to sustain that kind of maneuvering at FL 500 is extraordinary. And the EVA crew didn't describe a brief flash. They described something that looked like a sustained aerial engagement. That's a prolonged observation by a trained crew.
450 miles west of San Francisco, over open ocean, at an altitude where nothing should be flying, and two airline pilots are watching what looks like an aerial combat engagement. And Oakland Center sees nothing.
The location is significant for another reason. Open Pacific oceanic airspace, 450 nautical miles offshore, is beyond the range of most land-based radar systems. Oakland ARTCC handles that traffic primarily through satellite-based ADS-B, Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, which relies on aircraft transponders to self-report their positions. An object without a transponder in that airspace would be effectively invisible to ATC radar. The absence of a radar return in that location does not necessarily mean the object was undetectable. It may mean the detection infrastructure was not designed to see it.
That's an important technical point that gets overlooked. We tend to think of radar as a uniform net covering all airspace. It isn't. Over the open ocean, tracking is sparse, and what exists is largely transponder-dependent. If you're looking at objects that don't carry transponders and that don't have significant radar cross-sections, oceanic airspace is exactly where you'd expect them to go, undetected by ATC. The crew of EVA-008 may have seen something that the ground-based system was structurally incapable of tracking.
So we have three documents now: Houston 2009, Alaska 2023, South Dakota 2023, and now the Pacific Ocean 2024. And the thread running through all of them is the same: trained professional observers, anomalous objects, absent or incomplete radar returns, official FAA documentation, and in most cases, no resolution. The JAL 1628 file is the most complete version of this story, but it is very much part of a larger story.
The JL case gave us something these Skywatch reports don't have: duration. 50 minutes of sustained observation, multiple crew members, radar correlation from ground and airborne systems, and a federal investigation with transcribed interviews. Most of what we're reading now is a single page, a snapshot. But the snapshot keeps showing the same thing. That consistency, across decades and continents and aircraft types, is what I keep coming back to.
The final document in this section is FAA Skywatch Incident Report 237 UAP00612, dated February 19, 2024, unclassified, 1 page. This report documents a sighting by the crew of Air Transport International Flight 3498, a Boeing 767-300 freighter operating between Sacramento and Rockford, Illinois. The crew was eastbound at 37,000 feet when they reported the sighting. Air Transport International is a cargo carrier. This is not a passenger flight, but the crew is fully certificated commercial pilots operating under the same FAA regulations and training standards as any major airline. On page 1, the report states, Air Transport 3498 B763 SMF RFD reported seeing multiple lights moving and circling at FL 370 or higher. The crew first reported the phenomenon 20 nautical miles east-northeast of Michigami, Michigan. That is the Upper Peninsula, over sparsely populated terrain. The report then states, UAP not observed on ATC facility radar. The behavior described, multiple lights moving and circling, implies coordinated motion among multiple objects, not a single light drifting. Multiple objects in apparent coordinated movement at or above cruise altitude with no radar correlation.
Moving and circling. That's not a satellite, that's not a meteor, that's not a weather phenomenon. Circling implies sustained, directed movement. And you've got multiple lights doing it together at 37,000 feet over the Upper Peninsula of Michigan at night, seen by a cargo crew, and nothing on radar.
Cargo crews are actually some of the most reliable observers in these reports, and I'll tell you why. Passenger airline crews have a cabin full of people and a lot of distractions. Cargo crews are operating long flights, often at night, often over dark terrain with minimal ground light. Their situational awareness is focused almost entirely outside the cockpit. When a cargo crew reports something, they've usually been watching it long enough to rule out the obvious explanations before they pick up the radio. The circling behavior described here, that's something they watched for a while before calling it in.
You know what strikes me about all 6 of these documents taken together? The FAA isn't a UFO agency. These reports aren't coming from enthusiasts or hobbyists. They're coming from the federal system that manages the safest airspace in the world, filed by the most rigorously trained pilots on Earth. And the system keeps generating the same report over and over across 40 years.
That is precisely the evidentiary weight of this collection. Each individual report can be questioned. A single pilot, a single observation, a single night. But the aggregate record, spanning from the Houston TRACON logs of 2009 through the Skywatch system reports of 2023 and 2024, all channeled through the same federal aviation safety infrastructure, presents a pattern that is genuinely difficult to dismiss. The FAA's own documentation system has been consistently generating unresolved reports of aerial phenomena that do not conform to known aviation activity, and the JL 1628 investigation file sits at the center of that pattern as its most thoroughly documented expression.
The thing I want people to understand is that none of these pilots wanted to file these reports. Filing a UAP report is not a career-enhancing move. It was not in 1986 when Terauchi did it, and it is not now. The fact that the Skywatch system exists at all, that the FAA formalized a reporting mechanism, represents a significant institutional shift. Someone decided that the volume of reports was too high to keep handling informally. That decision, in itself, tells you something about the scale of what's been coming in.
And that brings us back to the core of what we've been building toward all episode. The FAA investigated JAL 1628 more thoroughly than any commercial aviation UAP encounter in history. They transcribed the pilot interviews, they analyzed the radar data, they brought in the military, they went public. And then something happened. Because the story of what the FAA did next, and what was done to the people who handled this case, is not the story of an agency that followed the evidence where it led. Okay, so we've spent the last section establishing the pattern. Pilots seeing things they can't explain, radar systems picking up objects that shouldn't be there, the FAA logging it all in real time. But I want to stay with that for a moment before we move forward, because what strikes me is how routine some of these reports feel. Like there's no panic in the language, it's almost bureaucratic, and yet the content is extraordinary.
That's exactly right, and that's worth sitting with. When you've been flying long enough, You develop a very high threshold for what gets your attention. You're managing systems, weather, ATC communications, your crew, your brain is constantly filtering. So when a pilot takes the time to pick up the radio and report something to a controller, something that they cannot identify, that is not a casual decision. That is a professional saying. This requires documentation.
That threshold is visible in the documents themselves. The next file I want to walk through is FAA Skywatch Incident Report 237 UAP 0051, dated May 20th, 2021, filed through the FAA Washington Operations Center. This one is different from the pilot-initiated reports we have been examining because it did not start with a pilot picking up the radio. It started with a controller.
A controller spotted it first? That's a different entry point entirely.
Correct. On page 1 of this report, it states, Mode C intruder alert observed by controller moving slowly to the NW50SE of RIC at FL 400. That is 50 miles southeast of Richmond, Virginia, at 40,000 feet. The phrase Mode C intruder is a specific technical designation. In air traffic control, Mode C refers to an aircraft that is transmitting altitude data. It has a transponder of some kind, but it is not squawking a valid identification code. The system flagged it as an intrusion into controlled airspace.
So it's not invisible to radar. It's showing up, it's giving altitude information, but it's not identifying itself the way every legitimate aircraft is required to. That's not a ghost return. That's something that is actively, in some sense, interacting with the system.
And that distinction matters enormously. A split image, or a weather return, or a technical artifact does not give you altitude data. Mode C means there is a transponder-like signal in the mix. Now, could it be a drone that wandered into controlled airspace? Possibly. But at 40,000 feet, 50 miles southeast of Richmond, you are well outside the operational ceiling of any commercially available drone. You are in Class A airspace. That is where airliners cruise.
And then the controller got visual confirmation. The same page states, first aircraft reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon just above them at FL 400. A pilot in the area was asked to look, and they looked, and they used the specific official terminology, unidentified aerial phenomenon. That is not informal language. That is a pilot filing a statement they know will become part of a federal record.
Hold on. So you have a controller who detects something anomalous on radar, a pilot who visually confirms something is there, and both of them are using official channels to document it. What happened next? Did this just get filed away, or did someone actually follow up?
It escalated. Page 1 continues. HQ Den requested KONR to look at replay. KONR observed primary target off the HPW-3 Bury 1 at 12 nautical miles. KONR is the continental U.S. NORAD region, the military's air defense command. They pulled their radar replay and found a primary target. Not a transponder return, not a Mode C hit. A primary target, meaning raw radar energy bouncing off the physical surface of an object. NORAD confirmed it.
Let me put that in perspective. NORAD exists to track everything that flies in North American airspace. Their radar systems are among the most sophisticated on the planet. When they look at a replay and say, "We see a primary target," that is not a casual observation. That is the United States Military Air Defense Command saying, there was a physical object at that location. That carries a very different weight than a pilot report alone.
Okay, so the FAA sees it, a pilot confirms it visually, NORAD confirms it on radar replay. That's 3 independent sources. This should be an open and shut case of something being there. But I'm guessing it doesn't end that cleanly.
It does not. The same page notes, HQ Den asked AMOC for replay and negative results found. AMOC is the Air and Marine Operations Center, a Department of Homeland Security asset that also monitors airspace. They looked at the same event window and found nothing. 3 agencies, 3 different sensor systems, and you get 2 confirmations and 1 blank. The data is internally contradictory, and the file closes without resolution.
That kind of sensor disagreement is actually one of the most consistent features of these cases. And it's deeply frustrating from an analytical standpoint. Different radar systems have different coverage areas, different refresh rates, different sensitivity thresholds. The fact that AMOC found nothing doesn't mean nothing was there. It may mean their system simply wasn't positioned or calibrated to capture it. But it does mean you can't build a clean, unambiguous evidentiary record. And that ambiguity is exactly what gets exploited later when someone wants to close a case.
That phrase, exploited later, I want to come back to that, because we're going to see exactly that process play out with the JAL 1628 case. But first, let's keep building the modern picture. Because what I'm hearing is that this is not a 1986 problem. This is happening right now, on commercial flights, in US airspace, being logged by the FAA.
The next document makes that point directly. FAA Preliminary Report 237 UAP00438, dated December 12, 2022, filed from the FAA Washington Operations Center. This one involves not one, but two separate commercial airline crews reporting the same object at the same time over Winnemac, Indiana.
Two crews, same object, same moment. That's exactly the kind of independent corroboration that makes a case hard to dismiss.
Page 1 states, Prelim info from FAA Ops Winnemac, in, W. Rock advised. UPS 2897, a Boeing 767, and JBU 2924, an Airbus A321, reported unidentified aerial phenomena UFO from the 12 o'clock position while eastbound at FL 500 to FL 600, 20 west of RWN. The time was 3:30 in the morning, Central Time. Two cargo and commercial crews, different aircraft types, different airlines, both looking ahead from their cockpits and reporting the same thing.
The altitude detail here is significant. Flight level 500 to 600. That's 50 to 60,000 feet. The 767 and the A321 both cruise in the high 30s, maybe low 40s at best, so whatever they were looking at was well above them at their 12 o'clock, meaning directly ahead. You're not confusing that with a ground light or a reflection off the windscreen. That is something in the sky above you, in the direction you are flying, and two separate flight crews on two separate aircraft called it in simultaneously.
And what's at 50 to 60,000 feet? I mean, that's above weather, above commercial traffic. The SR-71 flew at that altitude, the U-2. Is this a black program test flight?
Possibly. And that's always the honest answer. Possibly. But here's what I'd say to that. If it were a known military asset operating in that corridor, there are procedures for deconflicting airspace. Air traffic control would have been notified. The crews would not have been left to call it in as a UFO. The fact that two professional flight crews felt the need to formally report an unidentified object at that altitude, and the FAA logged it without an explanation, tells you that whatever it was not being acknowledged by anyone with authority to explain it.
The report also notes, no evasive action taken, no LEO notification reported. Law enforcement was not called, and the crews did not alter their flight path. The object was not perceived as an immediate hazard, but the report exists, it is unclassified, and it is sitting in the FAA's Skywatch database alongside hundreds of others just like it.
That database is the thing that keeps getting me. Because before Skywatch, before the FAA started formally logging these, how many of these reports just evaporated? A pilot calls it in, the controller makes a note, and then nothing. No standardized form, no escalation protocol, no archive. These things were disappearing into the bureaucracy for decades.
Most of them. And I'll tell you something. There was also a professional culture for a long time that actively discouraged reporting. You didn't want to be the pilot who called in a UFO. That was a career conversation you did not want to have. So the reports that do exist in the record represent a fraction of what was actually being observed. The pilots who said nothing, who chalked it up to fatigue or a trick of the light because the social cost of reporting was too high, those accounts are gone.
And that stigma, that professional pressure, we're going to see exactly where it comes from when we get to the JAL 1628 aftermath. But let me stay with the modern documents for one more moment, because I want to show the listener just how wide this pattern is geographically.
2 more recent reports underscore that point. FAA Skywatch Report 237 UAP Eurosum 594, dated December 28, 2023. Page 1 states, Memphis ARTCC advised N268CA, a beach BE9L, reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon from the left side while southeast bound at 16,000 feet, 5.4 nautical miles northwest of Hartselle, Alabama. No evasive action taken. Memphis Center is the air traffic control facility covering a large portion of the Mid-South. A general aviation pilot, flying a Beechcraft, reports something off his left wing at 16,000 feet, logged, unresolved.
Alabama, Indiana, Virginia, Alaska in 1986. These aren't clustered around military test ranges or unusual geography. This is happening everywhere, at every altitude, across decades.
And one more. FAA Operations Log 237 UAP 00596, dated January 19, 2024. Page 1 states, Memphis ARTCC advised NetJets 466, an Embraer E55P, reported an unidentified aerial phenomenon from the right side while southbound at FL 400, 3 east of Thayer, Missouri. No evasive action taken. A business jet at 40,000 feet over southern Missouri, less than a month after the Alabama report. Same filing system, same unresolved outcome.
What strikes me, looking at these recent reports together, is the language standardization. Unidentified aerial phenomenon. No evasive action taken. No law enforcement notified. The FAA has built a reporting infrastructure that captures these events in a consistent format, and what that means is that for the first time, you can actually start to do systematic analysis. Look at frequency, geography, altitude bands, time of day. That was impossible before Skywatch, and the data is already telling a story.
The story being, this is not rare, and it is not stopping. Okay, so we have the modern context. Pilots are still seeing things. Controllers are still logging them. NORAD is still occasionally confirming them on radar. The FAA has a system now, but I want to go back to 1986 because what happened with JAL 1628 is different in one crucial way. We have the pilot's own hand in the record.
That is precisely what makes the next document so important. This is JAL Flight 1628, FAA Investigation File 733670001, page 6, dated November 17, 1986, unclassified. This is not an FAA summary. This is not a controller's log entry. This is the handwritten report submitted by Captain Kenju Terauchi himself, written on Japan Airlines letterhead from Anchorage, in the hours after the encounter. It is 19 pages long, and it includes hand-drawn diagrams of what he saw.
He drew them. The captain sat down and drew what he saw.
Page 2 of this document contains those drawings. The description in the FAA file reads, one drawing depicts a Boeing 747 with 2 square-shaped objects positioned in front and slightly below the cockpit. A second, larger drawing on the same page illustrates a massive circular or walnut-shaped object with a central band, labeled with Japanese characters. Annotations include FL-350, flight level 35,000 feet. He drew his own aircraft for scale. He drew the 2 smaller objects in formation ahead of him, and then he drew the large one separately with its own diagram.
I want you to think about what it means for a captain. A man with 10,000 hours in the air, a professional who has spent his career operating in a world defined by precision and documentation, to sit down and draw what he saw. That is not the behavior of someone who is confused or embarrassed about their report. That is someone who is determined to communicate something accurately because the existing vocabulary is insufficient. He could not point to a photograph or a technical manual and say, "It looked like that." So he drew it.
And he was specific about distance. This isn't something was out there. He put a number on it.
He did. Page 3 of the same document contains another diagram showing the cockpit view, with an arrow pointing from the aircraft to the object annotated with 2,000 FTOWs, 2,000 feet. That is the captain's estimated distance to the object at close approach. For reference, a Boeing 747 is approximately 231 feet long. 2,000 feet is roughly 8 aircraft lengths. This was not a distant light on the horizon. This was something that, by his own careful estimate, was close enough to fill a significant portion of his forward view.
8 aircraft lengths, in the dark, over Alaska, at 35,000 feet. And then there's the speed annotation.
Page 9 of the same document, a hand-drawn diagram contains the annotation 900 kS, located near another annotation reading 35,000 ft, 900 knots. That is approximately 1,036 miles per hour, Mach 1.35, at altitude. The JL-747 was cruising at roughly 600 knots. Whatever Terauchi observed and notated was moving at half again his own speed, and this was not during a straight-line transit. The context of the encounter involves objects that repositioned, that maneuvered, that appeared and disappeared.
900 knots at altitude, maneuvering. That is not a conventional aircraft performance profile. Military fighters can reach those speeds, but they do not loiter. They do not pace a 747 for 50 minutes and then reposition to the side and then reappear behind it. The energy management required for that kind of sustained, variable speed proximity operation is beyond any aircraft I am aware of in any inventory. And I spent years flying in environments where I knew what was in the inventory.
So you have a captain who is precise enough to annotate distances and speeds in his hand-drawn diagrams. He's not saying it was fast and big, he's giving you numbers. Specific, checkable numbers. And those numbers are corroborated by what we established in the earlier parts of this episode. The radar data that the FAA's own system was logging in real time.
Which brings us to the radar record itself. JAL Flight 1628, FAA Investigation File, 733-67001, page 19, dated March 5th, 1987. This is a 179-page file containing the raw computer radar printouts from the night of the encounter. These are not summaries. These are the actual data logs generated by the FAA's radar processing system as the event was unfolding. And what they show is something the FAA's Public Affairs Office was simultaneously trying to explain away.
Okay, walk me through what's actually in these printouts, because I know radar data can be dense.
Page 3 of this document provides the key definition. It states, RT equals primary radar return, uncorrelated, skin, surface. That is the FAA's own glossary entry within the file. An RT is a direct radar reflection off the physical surface of an object, not a transponder signal, not a secondary return, not a weather artifact. It is raw radar energy bouncing back from something solid. And then the same page states, 19 equals number of uncorrelated returns. 19 separate instances. The FAA's own system counted them.
19, not one ambiguous blip. 19 separate primary returns from physical objects logged by the FAA's own radar during the JAL 1628 encounter. That's not a glitch.
19 primary returns over the course of an encounter is a substantial data set. In my experience, radar operators and analysts are very good at distinguishing between known artifacts, ground clutter, weather returns, mode error, and genuine anomalous targets. The fact that the FAA's own processing system flagged and counted 19 of these is significant. These systems are not designed to be credulous. They are designed to filter noise. When they log an anomalous return, it passed through that filter.
And the system had a specific designation for what it was logging. Pages 27 through 29 and pages 40 through 44 of this file contain data printouts with columns labeled UARN, UARM, and UARH. UAR stands for Unidentified Air Return. The FAA's radar processing software had a pre-programmed capability to flag and categorize anomalous targets. And during the JL 1628 encounter, that capability was activated. Page 40 contains a specific data entry. 2:20:41.874 JL 1628, UAR N1 NRM, with a notation showing the system was simultaneously tracking a total of 4 targets.
So the FAA's radar computer didn't just passively record the data, it had a category for this. It knew what an unidentified air return was, it had a column for it, and it flagged the JL 1628 encounter multiple times. That means someone, at some point, built this capability into the system because they expected to need it.
That's a fair inference. You don't build a UAR column into your radar processing software because you've never encountered one. That kind of system feature comes from operational experience. Someone encountered unidentified returns, realized they needed to be logged separately, and built the infrastructure to do it. The existence of the column is itself a piece of evidence about the institutional history of these encounters.
There is one more critical entry in this document. Page 20 contains a memo from FAA Public Affairs Officer Paul Steica. It states, "The Alaskan Region FAA Air Traffic Division has informed me that the intermittent radar images of Japan Airlines Flight 1628 on November 17, 1986, are the result of split images." Do you concur with this interpretation? Your response will be used to provide the news media and the public with an explanation. He was asking someone to validate a conclusion so that he could give it to journalists.
Wait, he's not asking, what do you think happened? He's asking, do you agree with the explanation we've already chosen? Those are very different questions.
That is precisely the distinction. A split image is a real radar phenomenon. Page 19 of the same document includes the FAA's own technical diagram explaining it. When a primary radar return and the secondary transponder return from the same aircraft arrive at slightly different moments, the system can display them as two separate targets. It is a known artifact. But here is the problem. The split image explanation, by definition, accounts for one extra return generated by the JL 747 itself. It does not account for 19 uncorrelated primary returns. It does not account for 4 simultaneous targets. And it does not account for what Captain Terauchi, First Officer Tamafuji, and Flight Engineer Tsukuba saw with their own eyes for 50 minutes.
The split image explanation is what we call a technically defensible but operationally insufficient answer. Yes, split images happen. No, split images do not explain this dataset. But if you're a public affairs officer and you need something to tell reporters by the end of the week, split image sounds authoritative, it's real. And most journalists won't dig far enough to find out it only explains one of 19 anomalous returns. It's a very effective way to close a story without closing a case.
And then there's what happened to the actual case files. Because this is where the story takes a turn that I think is going to land hard for the listener.
The last document in our primary set is JAL Flight 1628 Main Report, dated November 17, 1986. This is a package of FAA correspondence with researcher John Greenewald, Jr., who submitted requests for the full JL 1628 investigation file. What he received in return is one of the most extraordinary administrative responses in the history of government UAP documentation.
Extraordinary how?
Page 2 of this document states, "These documents do not include radar tracking data and simulated radar data for JL 1628. That is the FAA acknowledging that the most sensitive evidence, the actual radar records, was being withheld from the informal document release. They were offering some materials but keeping the primary instrumental evidence back. And then, on the same page, this. If I have not heard from you by July 12, 2001, we will consider your request canceled. In addition, all documents pertaining to this UFO sighting will be destroyed in 30 days from the date of this letter."
They threatened to destroy the files if he didn't drop the request. A federal agency told a researcher, "Withdraw your FOIA request, or we will destroy the evidence."
And page 3 confirms they followed through. It states, "The records you requested were destroyed in accordance with Federal Aviation Administration Order 1350.15c. Therefore, we have determined that the FAA Alaskan region has no records responsive to your request." The files are gone. The only surviving official summary, also on page 6 of this document, reads, "Narrative, unidentified traffic noted on radar by crew and ATC for an extended period of time." That is the entire official record. One sentence. Everything else was destroyed.
I want to be very clear about what that destruction represents. We spent the last hour walking through 19 uncorrelated primary radar returns, UAR designations, 4 simultaneous targets, a captain's hand-drawn diagrams with distance and speed annotations, formal crew interviews, ATC transcripts. All of that was in the FAA Alaskan region files. And a government agency, citing a routine records management order, eliminated it. What survived is one sentence saying something unidentified was on radar. The detail that makes the case is gone.
And that records management order, FAA Order 1350.15c. That's a real administrative process. It's not illegal, which makes it more troubling, not less. Because it means you don't need a conspiracy to destroy evidence. You just need a bureaucracy that applies its normal procedures selectively.
That is an important observation. The destruction of these records was procedurally compliant. What makes it remarkable is the timing. The threat to destroy them was issued in direct response to a formal FOIA request, which is the legal mechanism designed to make government records accessible. The message, whatever the intent, was, pursue this through official channels and the records will not exist by the time you get them.
Okay, so let me take stock of where we are, because I think the listener needs a moment to absorb this. We have a captain with an unblemished record who reported a 50-minute encounter with objects he could not identify. His crew confirmed it. Air traffic control confirmed it. The FAA's own radar system flagged 19 anomalous primary returns and logged them under a dedicated unidentified air return designation. The FAA's internal documents show a public affairs officer shopping for a predetermined explanation to give to the press. And then the files were destroyed. Is that a fair summary?
It is. And there is one more document. I have been holding it because it changes the frame on everything we have just discussed. Not the what of this case, the 19 radar returns, the crew testimony, the drawings. Those stand on their own. But the why. Why the split image explanation was prepared before the investigation concluded. Why the division chief who handled this case was reassigned. Why the official position shifted from corroboration to misidentification. This document answers that.
What document?
This is the Continental Command internal logs, document designation BV Continental Logs. What this document reveals, and I want to be precise about this, is not a formal paper trail of instructions. It is something more insidious. It is the anecdotal record of what happened inside the FAA after the JAL 1628 case became a public story. And it documents a pattern of institutional pressure that came not from within the FAA, but from outside it.
Outside it, meaning who?
What this document reveals is a campaign of internal ridicule and pressure with CIA involvement. The FAA division chief who handled the JAL 1628 investigation, the official who had initially supported the crew's account, who had allowed the radar data to be released, who had publicly stated that the FAA's radar had confirmed an unidentified object, was transferred. And following that transfer, the official FAA position on the case changed. The conclusion of misidentification, the split image explanation, the dismissal of the crew's testimony, that did not emerge from the investigation. It emerged after the investigator was removed.
I have to sit with that for a moment, because what you're describing is a pattern I recognize, not from UFO cases specifically, but from the broader institutional culture around sensitive incidents. When a case becomes publicly uncomfortable, when it attracts media attention, when it implicates capabilities that someone wants to protect, when it raises questions that powerful people would prefer not to answer, the response is rarely a direct order to suppress. It's more subtle. The person who championed the uncomfortable finding gets reassigned. Their replacement arrives with different priorities. The institutional position quietly shifts. And there is no memo that says, cover this up. There doesn't need to be.
So the CIA's involvement, what does that look like in this document? Because that's a significant claim. The CIA pressuring the FAA to change its position on a commercial airline encounter.
The document describes it as anecdotal. meaning it is not a formal directive with signatures and classification markings. It is the kind of record that captures what happened in practice rather than what was officially ordered. And what it captures is this. Following the public release of the JAL 1628 case details, there was a coordinated effort within the relevant agencies to reframe the incident. The ridicule was internal, directed at the investigation, at the investigators, at the credibility of the crew, and the CIA's fingerprints on that campaign are what this document documents.
Here is what I want the listener to understand about CIA involvement in a domestic aviation case. The CIA does not have jurisdiction over FAA investigations. The FAA is a civilian agency, so if the CIA was applying pressure, even informally, even through ridicule and back-channel conversations, that is an extraordinary overreach. The question you have to ask is, why does an intelligence agency care about a commercial airline encounter over Alaska? What is the national security interest in making a Japan Airlines captain look like he doesn't know what he saw?
And that's the question, isn't it? Because if the answer is he misidentified Jupiter or he saw a weather balloon, then you don't need the CIA. You don't need to transfer the division chief. You don't need a campaign of ridicule. You just publish the split image explanation and move on. The institutional response to this case is disproportionate to a simple misidentification. The machinery that was deployed to make this go away is larger than the explanation requires.
That disproportionality is the most important thing this document reveals. We have spent this entire episode building an evidentiary record, the crew testimony, the hand-drawn diagrams with specific distances and speeds, the 19 uncorrelated primary radar returns, the FAA's own UAR designation system activating during the encounter, the ATC transcripts, the formal crew interviews. That is an overwhelming body of evidence pointing in one direction, and the institutional response to that evidence was not to investigate further. It was to reassign the person doing the investigating, shift the official position, and eventually destroy the files.
What this tells me, and I want to be careful here, because I am drawing an inference, not reading a signed confession, is that there was a deliberate, coordinated decision at a level above the FAA to ensure that this case did not remain officially corroborated. Not because the evidence was weak, the evidence was strong, but because a strong, officially corroborated case of an unidentified object tracked by radar and visually confirmed by a commercial flight crew over U.S. airspace creates a question that someone, somewhere, was not prepared to answer publicly.
And Captain Terauchi, what happened to him? Because we've been talking about the institutional machinery, but there was a man at the center of this. A pilot who reported what he saw, who drew what he saw, who gave a formal interview to the FAA, who went on record.
Captain Terauchi was grounded following the public attention the case received. Japan Airlines reassigned him to a desk position. He was not grounded for his flying. His record was clean. He was grounded effectively for his report. He was eventually reinstated to flight status, but the message sent to every other commercial pilot watching that case was unmistakable. Report something you cannot explain, something that gets public attention, and your career pays the price. The professional stigma that Malone described earlier, the culture that suppressed reporting for decades. This case is part of where that culture came from.
Terauchi's grounding is one of the most consequential things that happened in this entire saga, and it gets almost no attention compared to the radar data and the object descriptions, because what it did was send a signal to every pilot in every cockpit. The system will not protect you if you report this honestly. That signal propagated through the aviation community for years. The reports that went unwritten, the sightings that were never logged, the controllers who decided not to escalate. Terauchi's experience is part of why those records don't exist.
So let me bring this all the way around. We started this episode with a quote from a pilot describing something he could not explain. It was not of this world. We've spent the last 2 hours building the case that he was not confused, not lying, not fatigued. He was a skilled professional who documented what he saw with precision, whose account was corroborated by his crew. by air traffic control, by the FAA's own radar system. And the institutional response to all of that evidence was to make it go away. The investigator transferred, the position reversed, the files destroyed, the pilot grounded. That is not how you handle a misidentification. That is how you handle something you cannot explain and do not want to explain publicly.
And JAL 1628 is not an isolated case. It is the most documented example of a pattern that the modern Skywatch reports confirm is ongoing. Controllers are still detecting anomalous targets. Pilots are still reporting unidentified phenomena. NORAD is still occasionally confirming primary returns that have no explanation. The infrastructure to suppress and dismiss was built in 1986, and it functioned. But the evidence it was built to suppress survived, in FOIA archives, in researcher collections, in the raw radar printouts that were copied before the destruction order was carried out. The case exists, the pattern exists, and the question of who decided it should not exist, that question remains open.
Which brings us to the question that has been underneath this entire season. We've now spent 4 episodes building a record. Lakenheath gave us military witnesses, ground radar, airborne radar all at once. JAL 1628 gave us a commercial crew, 50 minutes of proximity, 19 primary radar returns, and hand-drawn diagrams from a captain who wanted the world to know what he saw. The evidence that something real is happening in the sky is, at this point, substantial. But there is a question we haven't answered yet. Not is it real, we've established that. The question is, what did the people at the very top of the US government actually conclude about these objects? Not for the press, not for the public, in private, in classified documents at the highest levels. What did they decide?
In 1948, the United States Air Force conducted a classified study that reached a conclusion so alarming that the Air Force Chief of Staff personally ordered it suppressed. It was called the Estimate of the Situation. And what it concluded, what the analysts who spent months reviewing the best available evidence formally determined, is the subject of our next episode. The document was ordered destroyed. Most copies were, but not all of them. Next time, we find out what the US government secretly decided about flying saucers at the very beginning, and why they could not let anyone know.
Okay, let me sit with this for a second, because I think we need to say out loud what this case actually represents, taken as a whole. You have a 747 captain with 29 years of experience. You have his first officer and his flight engineer, both corroborating what he saw. You have FAA air traffic controllers who vectored another aircraft specifically to look for the object. You have ground radar returns. You have airborne radar returns. The FAA opened a formal investigation. And then, when the evidence pointed in a direction nobody wanted to acknowledge, the man who ran that investigation got transferred, the official conclusion quietly became misidentification, and Captain Terauchi got pulled from flight duty. That is the full arc of this story, and I find it genuinely infuriating.
Here's what I want people to understand. Because I've been in cockpits my entire adult life. When a pilot files a report, they know exactly what it costs them. It costs them credibility with their airline. It costs them credibility with the FAA. In some cases, as we've seen tonight, it costs them their seat. Terauchi didn't have to say anything. He could have logged an anomalous radar return, filed a vague weather notation, and moved on with his career intact. Instead, he described, in precise technical detail, something that paced his aircraft for 50 minutes over Alaska. You don't do that unless you are absolutely certain of what you saw. You don't do that unless you feel some obligation to say it.
The paper trail tells a very specific story, and it is not the story the FAA's final public position suggests. The investigation file contains 50 minutes of cockpit voice recorder testimony, formal transcripts from all 3 crew members, radar playback documentation from 5 separate simulation runs, and ATC communications logs showing controllers actively tracking the encounter in real time. That is not the file of an agency that dismissed this as a misidentification from the beginning. That is the file of an agency that took this seriously and then stopped.
And that stopping point is the thing that gets me. Because the FAA's own division chief, the man who actually ran the investigation, who went on record backing the crew's account, he gets transferred. The official conclusion shifts, and the file we're looking at tonight is what remains. A detailed, careful, thorough investigation that was essentially buried under a one-word verdict. Misidentification. After all of that, after 50 minutes, after 3 witnesses, after radar, after a second aircraft being vectored in, misidentification.
What you're describing is a pattern I've heard from other pilots who reported encounters. Not just in the 80s, but across decades. The initial response from the institution is almost always, take this seriously, document everything, investigate properly. And then, somewhere in the chain, something changes. The framing shifts. The language softens. The person who championed the investigation gets moved sideways. I'm not saying there's a single hand on a single lever making that happen. What I'm saying is the outcome is so consistent across so many cases that it starts to look less like coincidence and more like policy.
That is precisely what the document trail suggests. And the consequence of that policy, whether it is formal or informal, is that the pilots who report these encounters are left exposed. Terauchi described what he saw as not of this world. He used the word frightening. He gave the FAA everything they asked for: interviews, drawings, technical descriptions, cooperation. And the institutional response was to ground him and reframe his account as error. The message that sends to every other pilot considering whether to file a report is not subtle.
It's a chilling effect. That's the exact right term for it. And here's why that matters beyond just this one case. If experienced, credentialed commercial pilots are being systematically discouraged from reporting what they see, if the cost of honesty is your career, then we are operating with an incomplete picture of what is happening in our own airspace. The FAA's modern Skywatch program is a direct acknowledgement of that problem. But we have to ask how many Terauchis there were between 1986 and now who just didn't say anything.
More than you would think. I know pilots personally who have seen things they cannot explain and made a deliberate decision not to report them. Not because they doubted what they saw, because they'd watched what happened to people who did report. Terauchi's case was public. His grounding was public. That kind of thing travels through the aviation community fast. So yes, the chilling effect is real. It is documented in behavior, and it means the official record almost certainly undercounts what's actually happening out there.
Which brings us to where this season has been building. We started in episode 1 with the question of whether there is anything real in the historical record. We examined radar data, military testimony, official investigations. At Lakenheath, we saw multiple independent tracking systems confirm the same object simultaneously. And tonight, we have seen the most thoroughly documented commercial aviation encounter on record. 50 minutes, 3 crew members, multiple radar returns, a formal federal investigation, end with the key witness grounded and the lead investigator transferred. The evidence exists. The question the record has never answered is, what did the people at the very top actually conclude?
And that is exactly where we need to go next. Because here's the thing, all of this, Lakenheath, Terauchi, the radar returns, the FAA files, this is the visible surface of the record. These are the documents that made it out. But there is a deeper layer, and we just found it.
In 1948, the United States Air Force completed an internal analysis of every credible UFO report collected since 1947. The document was called The Estimate of the Situation. It was classified. It went up the chain of command all the way to the Air Force Chief of Staff. And according to the officers who handled it, the conclusion it reached was unambiguous. The analysts who wrote it did not conclude misidentification. They did not conclude atmospheric phenomena. They concluded something else entirely. And that conclusion was so alarming to the Air Force Chief of Staff that he ordered every copy destroyed.
Wait, you're telling me the Air Force's own analysts in 1948 reached a conclusion so significant that the Chief of Staff ordered the document burned? That's not a fringe claim. That's from inside the Air Force itself.
It is. And next episode, we go after that document, or rather, what remains of it, and what the people who read it said it contained, because a handful of copies survived, witnesses survived, and what they describe changes the entire frame of everything we have covered this season. We have spent 4 episodes asking whether these things are real. The Air Force asked that question in 1948. They got an answer, and then they tried to make sure no one would ever know what it was.
Next time, the estimate of the situation, the document the US government tried to erase from history, and what it actually said.